Our first speaker for the keynote speech is Simon Ashby from Audiokinetic.
Hello, 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 welcome. And I don't see you, that's a pity. A lot of new faces, some familiar faces, and it's really great to be here. Thanks, it's full crowd. Yeah, keynote session, it's a bit weird to realize that. And the reason for this is I've been invited earlier this year to do the keynote session at AES Tokyo last May. And a keynote is something I've never done before. And so the stress level was kind of important to me because I started researching about that, and it's much more about like something inspirational and talking about yourself, which I never do because I'm used to do many talks, but it's always technical and it's always, to the point. So anyway, I succeeded. I ended up, giving that talk, and it was okay, but it was not recorded or filmed or anything. So we said, okay, why not doing it again so that there's something for the posterity, and we decided to do that for the Wwise tour here in Helsinki. My very first time in Finland. It's been great so far. Everybody is super welcoming and smart and welcome. Anyway, it's so far got a lot of fun. So all right, are you ready? Yes? All right. There's energy in the room. Okay, so let's go into this keynote mode now. And the topic was, and is today, it's about harmonizing art and technology, and looking into that over the last 50 years, basically, since the birth of video game. And all that research started with questions where I was, yes, it does work, okay. So I was wondering, is it possible to harmonize art and technology, or is it something that, will always remain unbalanced? And I was also asking myself, is it even desirable, to reach this harmonization between the two, or is it better to have them challenge each other all the time? And as artists, are we victims of the technology, or should we just embrace those, those technological limits in order to be creative and so on? So, of course, in the course of history, there's been moments where the technology was really heavily impacting the artistic output that we could do. But in more recent times, it's kind of the opposite, where maybe the technology is not providing enough for us to really be able to convey and provide like our vision and what we want to do. So these are all interesting questions. I would be interested one day to maybe have a panel on this and invite like engineers and artists and so on. But anyway, I think what is really important to me is, keeping the individual in mind, keeping, our point of view and our goals as artists and engineers in the end, because we are the driving force making those games, and it's because of us if that thing is happening to our audience. So I'd like to tell you a fable. I told you, keynotes are different. So I'd like to tell you a fable that is attributed to Charles Péguy, a French poet, from the previous century. And the fables take place at a construction site where 3 stone cutters are, banging on stones with their tools. And passing by the very first stone cutter, he asks, "What are you doing?" And the stone cutter kind of look at this person with a strange look like, "Dude." Maybe not a century ago, dude was not really in the vocabulary, right? But dude, we're cutting stone, don't you see? And passing to the second stone cutter, and that person answered, "We're raising a wall." And finally, to the third stone cutter, that person with a smile answered, "We're building a cathedral." And to me, this fable is something that translates very well to creating video games, right? Because you need a lot of people that are attributed to different tasks, and together they work on something much bigger than their personal contribution in order to come up with something as fantastic as a cathedral. And to a certain extent, I believe building games is probably even more difficult than building cathedral, because have you found the blueprint for making every game fun all the time from the get-go, and plans to do that? So I think it's very hard, and it's really the quality of the interaction we have as teammates that makes the difference. My name is Simon Ashby. I'm one of the founders of Audiokinetic. I'm head of product, and I'm really proud to be with you today. And my goal today is really to, take a look at the past, see what was there, and go with that and look at where we're at today. And during that time, I'll take some time to talk about our own journey with Wwise and with Audiokinetic and how we came about with all that, and to conclude with a look at the future and try to extrapolate what it will be to make games in the future, and in what kind of environment, and so on. And throughout all that time, I want to take as much focus as us as individuals, us as creators, as engineers, as artists, because we remain the driving force behind the creation of those games and crazy projects that we do. All right. Is that good with you? Sounds like a plan? Still energy in there? Yeah? Okay, you're still smiling. All right. I really don't see you at all. Great. Okay, so about 50 years ago, actually almost precisely 52 years ago, in September of 1972, arrived the Magnavox Odyssey game. And 2 months later, in November, we had the Atari Pong there. And both games were virtual tennis, with paddles and the ball crossing the street. And one has been total commercial failure, and the other one has been the success we all know and all remember today. So, can any one of you guess what was the difference between these two games and why one was super successful and the other not? Sound, audio? Yeah, smart people. All right, exactly. Pong was making sound, and the Magnavox Odyssey wasn't. And of course, here, I'm pretty sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but to a certain point, we can say that without sound, there's no video game industry. Say that to your producer next time you negotiate your budget, right? It's thanks to us if you have a job. So, and the funny thing about Pong, the arcade version, the very first one that came out, is that they were not thinking about sound at all. And it's apparently, the story says, or the legend at that point, that Mr. Bushnell, Atari's president, asked his electrical engineer to come up with a solution. And that apparently was like the day before going into production. And Mr. Alcorn, the lead engineer, looked at the components that he had with there and focused on the sync generator. And the sync generator is the piece of technology that displays the picture on screen. Right? And if you remember the good old CRT TVs where you had the odd and the even lines displayed one after the other, and the reason why we're 25 frames per second in Europe is because the electric current is 50 hertz. North America, 60 hertz, we're at 30 frames per second. So we're cadencing that picture to be displayed. So to a certain point, this is your oscillator for a sound synthesizer, isn't it? You've got a clock and you've got a square wave with you. So that's where he connected. He tapped into that, and that's how we ended up with this fantastic piece of art. So I think we can agree that the technology was quite limiting to a certain point. Like the audio was created almost by chance by an electrical engineer. And even in this context, we can ask ourselves, is this art? I don't know what you think about that, but I think some people are smiling. So anyway, this is the birth of video game, and we have sound and pictures and something to play with. So comes the second generation of platforms, and we've got many of them, and the Intellivision console one. This is the one that my father purchased, so the very first one I own. Best day of my life, best year of my life, probably. Anybody played Intellivision here? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, yes, we've got a few. All right. So that console was interesting because with this now we had 3 channels that this platform could play. But the limitation was that they were all sharing the same attack and release and the same amount of noise. You could add noise to the tones, but they were shared and they were the same amount on the 3 voices. So with such a limitation, the composers or the engineers or whomever was responsible to make the sound for those games had to rely on a technique called voice stealing, where essentially you've got a priority system where the most important sound will steal voices from the least important sound. So typically, you're going to have your gameplay feedback sound effects that would be more important than the melody of the music in background. And here's a pretty good example of that. Sounds hard for me, or I don't know, in your ears. So, second generation. Now arrived the third generation of platform. This is the heydays of the Nintendo. So they released the Nintendo Famicom in Japan. 2 years later, the NES in the rest of the world. And now we've got, not only we have 5 channels, but we've got different waveforms. So our sound palette is much more diverse now with square waves and triangle and noise, and even sample could be played there. But you're still stuck with not a lot of memory on the cartridge for the entire game, let alone, the audio portion of it. So you could write, 1 or 2 themes, and then you had to rely on your smart programmers to use techniques like byte swapping and byte shifting and basically moving bytes around so that you can have modulations and permutation and parallel melodies coming on. So that was a way to take a little bit of music and extend the experience over time with that. And over the years, we got better at it, and some people got really, really good at it. And Kodaka-san is a good example with Journey to Silius, and listen to that score. This is really great. I've listened many times to that song. Anybody played that game by any chance? No? Oh, yeah, okay. Great. Okay, so third generation. Comes the fourth generation. Sega arrived there, and we've got the Super Nintendo. And now things are starting to get serious, where we've got 8 channels of 16-bit audio, 32 kilohertz per second, or kilohertz, sorry. Well, that's accurate. Stereo panning, TV or stereo now, so the console were leveraging that thing. ADSR, independent per channels, ADPCM compression, DSP effects, like name it. We have it all. And to a certain point, we can now emulate like a full orchestra with that. And this is what we got on some of the games like on The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. This is one of the games I've played the most, like in hundreds of hours. Probably other person here that done the same. Yeah, I haven't seen you smiling. So here's the introduction theme. You'll certainly remember that. Great stuff. So looking into the hardware and what was part of the Super Nintendo, you look at the board and you see, all the chips and the CPU and the memory. And when you focus on the audio DSP, you realize that Sony was the maker of the audio chip for Nintendo. So that really got me curious, so I started investigating more, and apparently they worked together, Sony and Nintendo, to produce the Super Nintendo CD back in those days. And the deal was that the console will have the cartridge, and that would be, royalty given to Nintendo, but CD, that was one of the Sony, that was one of the inventors of the CD at a time, will get the credits for the CD that you could put on the console. So, but that didn't work. Nintendo decided to go with Philips to do the Nintendo 64, and of course, guess what? Sony arrived with the PlayStation, the original PlayStation. And now we're serious. So not only they were providing the same DSP chips that we had in the previous generation, but there was also another piece of technology that allowed for Redbook audio, like CD quality stuff. 24 channels, 80 PCM, half a meg of memory for sound. This was like almost a cartridge back in the day. So this is crazy. This is really cool. And reverb and so on. So now, are we at parity with film? Right? We have the quality and we've got the gear for that. So yes, but at the same time, there's more and more content to cover because there's more capabilities for the graphics as well, and we're stuck in the good old thing where we have too many sounds and we need to compress them and lower the sample rate, and we end up with something that is much lo-fi or lower-fi than we first expected, and there's more repetition and so on. But yet, some people were really, targeting that Hollywood-like type of experience, and Metal Gear Solid, any fans of Metal Gear Solid, the original one? Okay, many more people as we're getting closer to present time. So that was the introduction thing and this Hollywood feel.
The nuclear weapons disposal facility on Shadow Moses Island in Alaska's Fox Archipelago was attacked and captured by next-generation special forces, being led by members of Foxhound.
Starts feeling like current games, right? Dialogue, orchestral music, sound effects, and all that. So, but I think it's fair to say, and again, I kind of picked the best examples from each of those generations. Like the average game were sounding much more average in general. But I think it's fair to say that during the first 5 generations of console, where the technology was really heavily impacting the artistic output, like the quality of the audio in the end. And so from there, from the 6th generation in 98 roughly to today, to the 9th generation, like we've seen new console, like we're seeing like our phones are playing games now, AR and VR devices and so on. But essentially, the last 25 years we've been, there's been no real revolution outside of being sample-based audio. And so what we've seen is, more storage from the DVD from the CD-ROM to the DVD to the Blu-ray disc. We've seen hard drive added, hardware accelerated codecs, that kind of thing. But it's been 25 years of, the first 25 years of synthesis, and where each generation was really impacting the artistic, the output, or the flavor to a certain extent of those consoles. But the last 5 or 4 generations, the last 25 years, it's mostly sample-based in there. So, but in any case, so 1997, this is where I started in that in that market. And I've been hired by Ubisoft. So Ubisoft is a French company, and eventually they created a studio in Montreal, in Canada. And I've been lucky to be the person, like the sound guy. After 6 months, they realized, oh, we're going to need the sound guy. And I've been lucky. I've been that sound guy that they hired, and I started at Ubisoft. And Ubisoft had a contract with Playmobil, the German company doing the Playmobil thing. And we had 3 games to make. And somebody in France was thinking that, oh, a single sound designer on 3 Playmobil games, that's okay because we will reuse the same sound across the 3 games. But just look at the artwork. They were really 3 different games. I took the challenge of trying to have one sound used in the 3 games, and I failed. We just needed something else. So quite rapidly, we realized that it was not a one army type of thing, and we needed help. So basically, I was responsible for, the technology, the integration, keeping up with the sound design, and, all the changes that we see over the 3 games, and making sure that we knew exactly what kind of assets to produce, the music, the format, the duration, all that. But we needed somebody to take care of the production, the audio, and hiring content providers and composers and so on. And that person was Martin Klein that we hired. And Martin later has been the founder of Audiokinetic and still today our CEO. So it's during those days where during the day we were doing our stuff, and during the evening we were regrouping together and look at the integration and start mixing the game and make sure that we were delivering an experience that was making sense. And just to give you an idea for the mixing flow back in the days, researching for this keynote thing, I stumbled on this Excel sheet. So I had this printed out on the side of my monitor, and it was a conversion between decibel to the linear volume that the sound editor that we had at Ubisoft, the little piece of technology or middleware, had this volume in linear value. So, for example, mixing back in the days was, I remember in one of the games there was a water fountain at the center of the village. So you get there, you listen to the sound, you say, hey, this is too quiet. It needs a good 3 dB plus. So you took your pen, your sheet of paper, water fountain plus 3. Soon enough, the game will crash. This is your opportunity. You go back to the sound editor, and now you say, okay, so the volume of that sound is 34, which is minus 11.5 dB. I want a plus 3. This is minus 8.5. So the final volume will be 48. And you enter 48. You save. Your project didn't crash. You're good. You do your banks. It didn't crash. You're really good. You recompile the game. You go to the restroom because that's 10 minutes. You go back. Finally, the game opens. You run to the water fountain, only to discover that it needs another 2 or 3 dB. And you put that. So that was mixing back in the day. So imagine doing that for a couple of years, 5 days a week, up to 10, 11, midnights, many Saturdays. And there were moments where Martin and I were looking at each other saying, if only there was a Pro Tools for interactive audio. If only doing a crossfade was not having to debate with a programmer for 15 minutes, telling him that it sounds much better when you crossfade than when you kill the voice and play the next one. That kind of arguments. So that's how the idea started. And so keep working at Ubisoft, work on the Myst franchise, work on Tarzan, on Jungle Book Rhythm and Groove. That's been a really interesting experience to me. So that game was already running for a while, and they decided to reboot the game. And we were 9 months from the release date, and they changed the gameplay completely, and they decided to make that a rhythm game. You remember the game Dance Dance Revolution, where you had arrows flying the screen, and you press those arrows on time? So that was really popular at that time. So they said, we want to do a Dance Dance-like type of game, but with the Jungle Book franchise, you have 9 months. And they took me from the project I was on, and they say, Simon, help us. And we said, okay. So at the time, we had a game engine that could render 3D graphics, and that's it. So how do you synchronize an entire game on the clock and have something compelling and so on? So to me, as a sound person, I immediately thought about, the music sequencers that we had, like the Cubase and those type of things, where you have your tempo and your bar and beats going on, and you've got tracks, but this time instead of having music tracks only, it was synchronizing the camera movement. It was a track for the arrows in easy mode and medium, hard, expert, having the animations, and everything basically was sequenced in our event synchronizer. That was we had our arrow editor. We even had the karaoke editor. So 9 months, that was kind of cool. So, and the programmers told us, okay, we can build that thing in time. We had 9 songs to do, the 9 main characters in Jungle Book. But one thing they didn't know they could do was to interpolate the arrows in between frames. So that meant that the engine was running at 15 frames per second. So that means that if you do your song at 120 BPM, this is an even number of 15 frames, you're good. But then if you run at 14 or 16 frames, you have to set the tempo of your song to 112 or 128, and so on. So to the composer, it was like, man, pick whatever tempo you want, as long as it's one of the tempo you see here. And so that was fine. What was much more difficult was to convince the animator that they had to animate the dancing character, and they had only 1 bar to do all the moves. And because at the end of every measure, the game will determine if you were performing like super well to have cool move, or no, if you're stumbling and nothing is working. And they were forced to, do that full bar thing, and they had to have a keyframe in the middle so we could transition to any animation, and they didn't like that. You're killing my artistic expression and that kind of thing. It was really a struggle to get them to realize that's the only way, and we only have now 6 months, 5 months, and so that was interesting. Anyway, so here's an idea for the game.
Now I'm the king of the swingers, whoa, the jungle VIP. I've reached the top and had to stop, and that's what's bothering me. I wanna be a man called, stroll right into town and be just like the other men. I'm tired of walking around, whoa, whoopie-doo. I wanna be like you. I wanna walk like you, talk like you do. You gonna see it's true, and they like me. I can learn to be human too.
Cool stuff. So in the early 2000s, even when you build tools custom for a type of game, what I realized was that it's not only about the tools, and it's about us, again, as human being, being able to say, okay, I accept that I'm limited in what I can do and so on, and the technology blocks us in a certain path, and I need to be expressive in that thing. And that was the very difficult thing to do. And it was our capacity, to understand that, yeah, we're all stonecutters in our own fashion because we have a greater goal of building that cathedral. And Jungle Book was not a cathedral. A small church, a chapel at best. But yet, 9 months, a small team, we accomplished that. But it also, we came to the realization that if cutting stone by hand is too difficult, too long to create those more ambitious games, maybe you need to come up with better tools. And maybe sometime you need something, industrial strength, and that's right. So, and that's how Audiokinetic and Wwise emerged, basically, because we realized going to GDC was an eye-opener on that. Well, it was not a problem at Ubisoft. Actually, Ubisoft had the sound editor and some tools of its own. Most of the industry, people were hard coding everything in C++. Or the best editor ever, Excel. You've got your sounds, 1 line per sound, and you've got your columns for volume and pitch, and is it looping, yes or no, and that kind of thing. So we said, okay, it became really clear for Martin and I that the whole industry was in need for tools that will really help us, audio artists at least, to come up with soundscapes that would be engaging and, and really good. And the benefits of that is maybe we will be able to come back home for dinner and not late at night when everybody is already in bed in the thing. So that was the side benefit that we were hoping for that. So at that point, we said, okay, what are we lacking? We were asking those questions. And for us, it was clear, like we were hacking. We needed to hack in order. But we were lacking creative control, technical control, efficiency, that kind of thing. And to the question, what do we want to achieve? We wanted to achieve to offer sound artists a workflow. And workflow is an important word in that sentence. A workflow and tools that will help them create compelling interactive experience. So when we say workflow in 2024, it's pretty clear now. We've got tools and so on when we're used to production flows and workflow. But back at the era where you're hard coding everything, what is a workflow that really help artists speeding up their thing? So we settle on 5 main steps, if I could say, for that workflow. And that slide, by the way, was used even before we released the first version of Wwise. We're using that slide to explain our concept to first people, investors and so on, and later to game developers. So the first step is really to author your thing. So you create your dialogue, your music outside in a DAW, fine, and you import that in Wwise and starts the authoring. You put the behaviors, you put your sound properties, and all the indication to have this content playing as you expect. And especially back in the days, the game engines were much more flaky than today. Like we have it good today, like Unity and Unreal and Godot, and even the proprietary game engines are really solid nowadays. Back in the days, at least at Ubisoft, my personal experience, like all the time, like it was working yesterday, and for the next 3 days, nothing was working, and you cannot test your content in the game until somebody find a problem. So for us, it was important that we could simulate in Wwise, using the Soundcaster, for example, and you play your music, your dialogue, your sound effects, and you can start pre-mixing that content, you can start validating the aesthetics and that kind of thing. And eventually, all right, you're good. You can start integrating your content into the game, and when you arrive at mixing, no need for a pen. Now you're connected live to the game, and you're making those decisions connected, and you get the direct feedback from it, while looking at your performance. How much memory, how much CPU are you using, how much bandwidth from the DVD are you taking, that kind of thing. And to a certain extent, we can look at this workflow in 2 different type of timelines. So it's both doing that 25 times during the same day, where you, as soon as you add new content, you can go over all those steps. But it's also a metaphor for a 2-year production, where in the beginning you do a lot of authoring and integration, and nearer the end of the project you do a lot of mixing and profiling and troubleshooting, and that's when your lead architect reminds you that audio should not take more than 10% of the CPU. You heard that before? Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So that kind of thing. So for us, it was, and day one, the very first version of Wwise, we already had the profiler and all this data, because this is what is important to achieve. Yes, it has to sound good, but it has to sound good with, the budget that we're assigned to. So anyway, we go like that. In 2006, we released the first version. We had a studio from Microsoft that started with a beta version and shipped a few months later, Shadowrun, our very first game. And at that point, you can ask yourself, was Wwise an instant success? Right? For the first time in history, all right, big word. First time in history, there is a tool readily available out there on the market, if you're interested, that you can license, and it harmonizes art and technology. Right? So, was it an instant success? What's your guess? No, exactly. And I think we, again, underestimated the human factor, in all those things. So, You arrive with a good piece of technology, fine, but who are you, Audiokinetic? What do you know about game? We never heard about you. And personally, like, who's that French-speaking, barely speaking English with a strong French accent guy that is too excited and, trying to convince people that this is the thing? So, yeah, it took a lot of time. There was a lot of resistance. We had some early adopters. You probably know the crossing the chasm curve. You probably heard about that thing in selling products. So there's always people that are willing to jump in, but it's a minority of people, and it takes a lot of time to convince the mass and have stronger adoption. So what do? Well, you start visiting them all, and you go at all the conferences, and you speak with them, and eventually they get to know you, and eventually they get to realize that, okay, maybe these guys knows what they're doing, and some games starts to release, and you say, okay, those are great-sounding games, and we finally started having some adoption, but it took a while, and yeah, much more time than we wanted, actually. Eventually, we opened a studio in Japan, just for the time difference, the language barrier, the cultural barrier as well. Later, same thing in Shanghai about 5 years ago. Last year in the Netherlands, in Hilversum, which is nearby Amsterdam. And just again, to be closer to you, to be closer to the people using the product and having an idea for what's to come in the future. So if we look now where we're at, we've got 3 main segments in which Wwise is used. So, of course, gaming is the main one. That's where we started. That's the bulk of our business and the development and so on. But there's more and more location-based entertainment products out there. And by that, what we mean is, sophisticated escape rooms or theme parks where they have rides, where there's moments where there's interactivity going on. You have to shoot spiders or things like that. And they tend to use Unity and Unreal to do that, to render the graphics. And Wwise is a really good fit for that kind of environment. So this is cool. This is growing. And if you're a sound designer, and you may be working on games or not, but there's also this market that is emerging and needs your expertise in that type of field. And finally, the automotive sector. And we started in 2014 porting Wwise to the automotive platforms and reality. And the timing is just perfect. It's this October that we have the very first vehicle that will hit the road with Wwise in it. So Changan is a small company the size of Ford. That's the thing with China. It's so big that we never heard of Changan, but yes, it's big. They do electric vehicle, and it's not too late. You can pre-order if you're interested. And they're using Wwise for the ride sonification and for 3D alarms, to localize, 3D, where's the thing, instead of just having a beep in the dash of the car. And for the sound as well when you're running. Electric vehicle at low speed have to emit sound. So that kind of thing is used for that. Okay, so let's look a bit at the foundations of Wwise. So of course, there's the runtime. That's the sound engine running on all the platforms out there. If you can run a game on a platform, we have to port Wwise there because that's your business. You need to get your games on as many platforms as possible. And of course, facilitate the integrations into the main commercial game engines like Unity, Unreal, Godot now, and to proprietary game engines. The authoring, that's another pillar, of course. That's where a lot of the action happens. And what is really important to us is the ecosystem around Wwise. So starting with the partners. And the best partners that we have are the one that helps, integrating Wwise with the rest of the game development workflow. Or the ones that are providing tools that, solve specific problems. Those are the best partners there because they facilitate your life and they get you closer to the end goal. And even more important than that is you, the community. All of you using Wwise, sometimes sparingly, sometimes every day, but it's really thanks to you that we exist, right? And if what I like to do when I go from city to city is to visit developers, and if I try to reach out to you and you're using Wwise, be sure that I will ask you much more question than I will talk about Wwise or things like that. Like, I'm really interested in knowing what is working well, fine, but what is working less well? Please tell us that. And please tell us what is your vision for 5 years from now and 10 years from now? Because we want to make sure that we will have those building blocks in place when we will arrive at that time. So don't hesitate to share. It's important. And finally, the knowledge sharing. That's another big point where not only us, doing material and sample games and blog articles and things like that, and more recently having certifications and all that, but also having our community to share. So if you're subscribed to the blogs, like every week, there's an article about somebody that is writing about how they overcame, certain limits or how they achieved certain result in their last game. And it's great because sometimes it's, a person in China writing an article that we translate in Korean and Japanese and English and French so that it may help you, because you have a similar problem, but it's somebody from China that you will never see in your life probably and never be able to speak directly with, but, via those things, it helps. So that's really, really important. So if we wrap up our contribution to this, I think we can say that we empowered artists to overcome technological limits by establishing a workflow, establishing a vocabulary. Like, it seems like a simple thing, but 20 years ago, there was 5 different ways to talk about a random container or a real-time parameter control and so on. Now we kind of share the same vocabulary. So you hire somebody from a different company and they're kind of, up to speed day 1 or day 1.5, it goes fast. And finally, a standard way to conceive audio. And I've got this feedback so many times, like people tell me they have a new challenge, something new, and they automatically know, how to go about it and how to arrive with the right result. Said differently, we can say that our contribution is also to allow you to, come up with any type of aesthetics, any type of sound that you're after, with any type of resources is available to you. And those 2 knobs have to be able to move in whatever direction, without dependencies between them. Because technical constraint is something, but it shouldn't prevent you from doing something artistic and something engaging and meaningful in the end. So I think we're playing a definitely role into harmonizing art and technology. And I think we can be proud of this accomplishment. I think it's a good step. But is it enough? Right? Is it just a momentary passage there? Will it last? It's not clear. It's not clear to me. It's one stage. We're there now, but what it is for us in the future, right? So let's try to take a peek at the future and see where we're heading. And how are you doing? How is it? You're still there? Yeah? Okay. And you're still smiling, some of you. Okay, good feedback. Thanks. All right. So let's look at the future. So we all know that the future is made of many lines and dots, right? Okay, no, you're not really there. Yeah, okay. I'm just rambling. Okay, so if we look at our production today, we all produce dialogue and music and sound effects, and more we use the geometry to do fancy sound propagation systems and dynamic mixing and all that. But if we look into what we're doing, we realize that it's all a manual process. Any of these sounds, any of these settings, like there's a human being that's, move the dial and curate those things. So, all right. Now, a way to try to predict the future is to look at the trend from the past, and you tell yourself, if we continue in the same direction, we can kind of derive what the future may look like. So I decided to take this approach looking at how many people were working on AAA games like 25 years ago, and how many sounds we were producing on average. Again, it's just an average. But let's say in the 2000s, producing 5,000 sounds with a team of 3 people, that was a fair production for a AAA game. And you push 10 years later, Now you produce 50,000 sound with a team of 15. Yeah, that's pretty much an average that was there. Closer to today, producing 500,000 sound with a team of 75, this is not unheard of. The very first game with 1 million sound in Wwise was in 2011, just to tell you. So it's been a while that we're producing too many assets to a certain point. And when I say 75 people, I'm not saying like 75 like people full-time in the studio, but when you start looking at your composers, the contractors, the legal, the voice directors, all the translations and that thing, like it sums up rapidly to that kind of number. So essentially, every decade, we kind of multiply the number of assets by 10, and the team grew by a factor of 5, roughly. So let's take that and let's push 10 years in the future, producing 5 million assets on average, and 10 years later, 50 million of assets. I believe we'll reach those numbers. But I certainly don't believe that we will be teams of 300 and 2,000 people. That doesn't scale. Imagine that. Imagine 2,000 people in the audio team only. So how many animators and modelers? And so this is not imagine the budget. So we will have to produce 50 million sound in a not too distant future, but with roughly the same size of team. So we desperately need a disruptive technological breakthrough. It's unbearable. Like, we cannot do otherwise, right? We are at a point where art, now it's the other way around. It's the technology, there's too much art to do, and we need help from the technology to get there. So in the future, I think there's no other way than to accept that we will have to rely on text-to-speech, right? And by that, I'm not saying, I'm assuming here that we are compensating the actors appropriately. I'm not saying we're stealing their models and not paying them. I'm saying we hire those actors, they record, the main lines, maybe some of the cinematics, the trailer, things like that, the important dialogue, but the rest can be text-to-speech. And imagine if you have that number of lines, it means like if you have 200,000 dialogue lines just for you, it probably means like 18 months in the studio, 4 hours a day with the same sound recordist and the same voice director. Who wants to do that, right? Even for the actors. They don't want to spend their life in the studio. They have better things to do. So we have to rely on those things. Same thing with music. We'll keep working with composers. They write fantastic music themes, like we've got Goosebumps and all that, and that's really good. But what is really tedious right now is we ask those composers, okay, can you export all the stems possible? Can you split the music into, 2 bars or 4 bars and so on? And they do a lot of fiddling around that has nothing to do with their art, which is writing memorable music, right? So let's use the machine for that. There's better ways. And I think we can extrapolate that to everything we do, like with sound effects, like the sound propagation, like understanding the geometry and optimizing it automatically for audio so that we just have sound propagation working 98% of the time, and you put your humans to fix those 2% of edge cases. That's a much more rational approach to it. And same thing for mixing and so on. So the production workflow of the future will most certainly look like what we are seeing with ChatGPT and some of the machine learning tools out there, where as an artist, you set your priorities, your mood, and your aesthetics, that kind of thing. You let the system generate propositions, and as an artist, you iterate, and you do that feedback loop until it works. But it's still, with all that, we still have humans working. We still have engineers, we still have artists to better inform those things and come up with the right thing. So we have to, the human, I think, this is my take. I hope it will be like that, but I really wish that we will keep the human in there, and it will be the interaction of all the humans in a team that will make the difference between the failure or the success of our future games. So, yeah, definitely, the future of video game remains a collective experience. So, If our future projects remain collective experience, I'd like to invite you, when you're back to work tomorrow, to ask yourself and ask your teammates, are you cutting stones? Are you raising walls? Or are we together building cathedrals? Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. So, before I move on, does anybody have any questions?
It's kind of weird to have a
It
Q&A after
is.
that,
Question
isn't it?
over here?
Oh yeah, we got questions. Thanks.
Yes.
Of course, it's very scary to think about like how much asset, how much control we might lose in the future, just kind of running for this kind of huge, bigger games and all that. And today we have we still have this thing where like it's easy to write, for example, to write a tool to kind of get like dynamically the size and materials of a room to do like reverb. But we still do a lot of work manually because we want that aesthetic to come in. It doesn't have to be realistic, but we want that to go through. So how do you think we're gonna kind of manage that? Because again, there's a lot of manual work because we want to go in still and do room by room, going through this kind of narrative and controlling the emotion of the player. How do you think machines or other tools will come in to help us do that without us like losing control that we so much like need for these things?
Yeah, and the word control in your question is so important. And it's at the core of all the decisions we make when we design new features and so on, is how much control we can expose to the artist. Again, for the aesthetics, but also control over how much memory and CPU you're willing to invest, or you're able to invest in whatever systems that is in front of you. So exactly how, I don't know yet. And right, so what we're doing right now, so for example, in our Unreal integration, there's already a feature that can evaluate the size, the volume of the rooms. And by volume, I mean the size, not the gain, but the size. And from there, derive an RT60, which is the duration of the late reverb. And from there, select the right share sets that you already pre-assigned with different volume. So you get a first pass, and you get late reverbs of different durations automatically with that feature. So at least you have that. You've got your ground covered. But yes, after you want a human to go there and say, okay, for this specific room, right, I need something that fits better that the mood that I'm expecting for it. Or it sounds good, but gameplay-wise, there's a lot of dialogue, and I want less reverb to get more space for the dialogue. Whatever reason, right? Is it the game context and so on. So how exactly, I don't know. We do our own R&D. There's tons of R&D outside, and that's why I was saying, and that's why we're asking so many questions, because the answer is somewhere collectively. It's part of our brains, and we will, assemble that and eventually come up with better tools to get there.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, maybe how wasn't the right, but it's just kind of how do you see that kind of happening? Or like again, the control is very hard to give, like as a designer.
Yeah.
To anything else.
Right?
So
we went from having no control at all to now we have a lot of control, but we have a new problem where there's just too much stuff to control. So we have to let go, and that is scary. Letting go of the control is scary. It's like raising your kids, right? Eventually, you have to let them go, and that's, well, as a parent, that's your responsibility. As an artist in a game, I don't know. Like you don't want them to become things you don't want them to become. Yeah. Any other question? Yes, just in front.
Simon, pleasure to see you. Almost like 12 years from the first time, but seeing how Wwise evolve and become friendlier and integrated even more so, and as also your kind of projection of the sound teams and you and Martin starting being just two guys, now an indie game that is here and reaching, tons of people in streaming platforms, also the gaming team itself is becoming only one person, sometimes plus two. So what about Wise with all this, development of technology that is more automated, make it friendly for the non-audio people? So that's another approach, because we have always, the audio people have to count on the last resource, the last hour, the crunching time, but all the people that are above us are still growing. What about if we, share the payload? They can actually write, or they can actually integrate things before we get the last part of the artistic value to it. Then the tech side cannot be just put upon us. So more than with you that a lot of things will be automated in the future, but what about if we make it even more friendly than it already is?
It's a good question. And again, control is part of your question as well, and it's but where the spin, how to leverage the rest of the team to help us there. And interestingly, so back early 2000, before we start marketing in a sense, putting to the market Wise, we had to decide on a licensing business model. And the dominant model was the per seat, like Photoshop, like Pro Tools, like those things, right? You cost that amount per seat and you're good to go. And this is not what we wanted to do. And that's why we went with the licensing per title and per console, because we wanted anybody in the team to be able to install Wise and contribute to a certain extent. So it's important, because if you don't do that, then people will pay 1 or 2 license for the sound designer, the programmer won't have one, your QA team won't have any license, but it's much more efficient to have your QA team connecting to a profile version of the game, seeing a problem with audio, packaging the profiler session, put that in Jira, and then you've got somebody from the audio team like troubleshooting that kind of thing. So we wanted the entire team to be able to install Wise if they wanted to. So it was already in our mindset there. Now, in terms of specific tools and so on, well, most of our attention has been given to the audio people thus far. And there's some automation, like I was saying, in Unreal with determining the late reverb thing. But yes, I think as we evolve, that thing, grow and so on, I believe, like organically we'll get there, and it's going to be easier for non-audio specialists to contribute to it as well. But again, how exactly and when? TBD. And if it becomes more and more important, you'll tell us, and we will make sure that we develop that thing. We're really, we have a certain idea for the roadmap of Wise, but this is like maybe 50% of it. The rest is driven directly by the feedback we receive from you. So please share. Don't hesitate. And when we visit you, open your heart and tell us where you want to go with that. And we take that into account, and it ends up in the product for sure. Yeah. Are we on time? Are we?
Last question.
Last question?
Yep.
Cool.
Thank you for the inspiring speech.
Thanks.
So you mentioned the history of audio, and in the first few generations it was more synthesized, synth-driven, and then later it was sample-based. And going forward, we will have generative sound generation, like generative AI. And somewhere in between there has been also procedural audio. And how do you think procedural sound generation will play a role in the future? And do you think that will be supercharged by AI? And how do you think Wise will be contributing to this?
Okay, so that's an excellent question. So let's start with AI and machine learning, because there's so much money invested into that worldwide and all thing, and there's tons of money into audio as well. And so we are doing our own AI thing, but the world is vast and so on. So we know that companies or people will come up with fantastic tools. So for us, the first or one of the most important thing to do is to make sure that we adapt Wise so that kind of technology can be easily integrated. So we have the plugins, for example, for DSP or Source, so that's an easy way to integrate there, but we need to extend that so that it takes that kind of AI and machine learning technology, and it's easily integratable into Wwise. So this is really important, and this is something that it's already started, and we'll go over the next few releases of Wwise, make sure that it's easy to connect that kind of tech. And maybe some of it will come from us, maybe, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be coming from a lot of partners out there. In terms of procedural audio per se, like if you say procedural audio like MaxMSP or Pure Data, for example, Pure Data is a good example where people were asking, why aren't you integrating Pure Data? And our answer was always like, if it was not sounding that bad, we would probably have it in there. So one of the criteria when we create things or integrate things, we use the Hollywood-ready type of things, like does it sound as good as the best production you can do? And if so, all right, it has its place there. But historically, Pure Data and so on, it sounds like, okay, it does something, but is it Hollywood-ready? No. So that's why we haven't invested necessarily into integrating those techs or developing our own. How will it be in the future when it's informed by AI and machine learning? If it's really lead us to better direction, yeah, why not? Like when we introduced MIDI into Wwise a decade ago, as a side project, we had the Synth one. Have you used that as a source plugin in Wwise, Synth one? That was just the most basic synthesizer we could do. And my idea with that was, let's put it there, and people will request more of it, and they will want more feature, and we'll come up with a real synth later, and maybe we'll call it Synth 2 or something else. And nobody cared. And nobody asked for synths and better thing like that. So we said, okay, it's a good idea. We believe it's fun. I was strongly, right, I was excited by that, but nobody cared. So we said, okay, we got Synth 1. It never moved since then because it's not important to you at this point in time, apparently. So yeah, so we'll see. We'll see how things evolve, and when it's time and when people are saying we need that kind of tools, of course, we'll add it to it. So, all right, I think we are at the end. Thank you very much again. You're a really good crowd. Thank you.
All righty then. Thank you very much, Simon.